everyone. Welcome to the Entropy Podcast. I'm your host, Francis Gorman. If you're enjoying our content, please take a moment to like and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, I'm joined by Paul Tracey, the founder and CEO of Innovative Technologies, a leading cybersecurity firm based in upstate New York since 2012. He helps small and mid-sized businesses strengthen their security, compliance, and IT resilience. Paul is also known for two Amazon best-selling books, Cyberstorm and Compliance Made Easy. He's also a recognized thought leader, and it's fantastic to have him here with me today. Paul, how are you keeping?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
It's great to have you on, Paul. And I think I want to talk about a couple areas today, but I want to start off on the space that you're in around the kind of SME marketplace. There's a perception, and it's maybe because we only see the headlines when a big company gets caught in terms of a cybersecurity breach, but small businesses are just as susceptible. In your experience, can you bring that to light for me? Can you talk a bit about the SME market and the risk factors that they also face in this space?
Absolutely. And that's a great point because it's a giant misconception, right, in the business world. And so just for a little bit of background, I worked in enterprise IT originally. And it was that disparity that kind of moved me to start my own business, in that they had the funding, the knowledge, et cetera, and just didn't do anything with it. And very quickly I realized, well, if this is the case in enterprise, what do small businesses look like? And what I found was rather shocking. And so that's kind of where my business started from. One of the things that we know is 43% of cyber attacks now are going to small and medium-sized businesses. But 100% of the business owners in that market that I talk to don't think they're a target, right? And so that creates a big problem. And if you're a small business, the impact of an attack or an incident like that is much greater, in that your resources probably aren't as robust to be able to handle not only the incident, but then the outcomes that follow that. And so it's really a big issue, right? If you don't understand the risk, then how can you possibly protect yourself against them?
And Paul, what type of attacks are you seeing against SMEs? So is it invoice redirection fraud? Is it ransomware? Is it phishing attacks leading to compromise and exfiltration of data? Is it all of the above? What do you see mostly occurring in these spaces?
Well, I hate to use the term low hanging fruit, but that's really kind of what we have in small to medium sized business. So we're seeing all of the attacks. Generally, what we know is small businesses don't necessarily have the security infrastructure. So phishing becomes the number one point of entry. That may not be the scope of the attack or how they get in to the network, but it is how they gather information that then gets them into the network if it doesn't directly. And so then we end up at what security do we have on our email? Do we have multi-factor authentication enforced? But then the big part of that is, are we training the staff against the phishing email if that's the number one entry point, right? For small and medium businesses, 95% of their incidents started out as a phishing attack in an email, or potentially a fake website link, that type of thing.
That is interesting, yeah. So the initial vector has been still the phishing email in the SMEs. I suppose you can fire and forget with them, and they don't necessarily have to be targeted attacks in that case. The, in terms of ransomware, I'm interested. So if a big corporation gets hit, they have the ability to bring in negotiators to maybe pay, to restore from backups, etc. But when an SME gets hit, the likelihood is they don't have any of those pieces of resilience built into their enterprise. I read that no one has ever paid a ransom under your watch, Paul. I'm not sure if that's fake news or if it's fact, but I'd like you to talk a bit about that if it's true, and I suppose the methodology or the guidance that you provide when an incident like that occurs.
So it is true. As shocking as that may sound, none of our clients have ever paid a ransom. Um, and I think that comes from a couple of different strategies. First is prevention, right? But if anybody's been in cybersecurity or even watched the news, we understand that regardless of the security, there can be gaps and people can get in. And so if they get in and you have a ransomware attack, what does that mitigation look like? What is your plan for dealing with it, right? I think all throughout life we have examples where things have happened to us, right? And we did or did not have a plan for that potentiality. And the outcomes when you have a plan are much greater in your favor than when you don't. And so immediate detection, right? How fast can we identify the threat and shut it down? If there is, we, you know, someone gets into the network and is able to lock down equipment, the next step there is to make sure that they're not able to get to the backups, right? Because that's really the key when you see people paying the ransomware, is because they weren't able to restore from backup, meaning the hackers got in, encrypted the backups as well. And now, once that occurs, you're really in a situation where you're almost forced to pay. I mean, you cannot pay, but most businesses can't handle losing all their data and continue to do business, right? That's a nearly impossible feat. Uh, so we want to make sure we're doing all the prevention that we possibly can, but there also needs to be mitigation if something does happen. How far can it get? And the very last wall of that is making sure that you have backups that are secure, that are not accessible if someone does get into the network, so you can restore that data. Uh, does it still suck to have an incident like that? Yes. Um, there's no way around that. It's not a fun time. You've got, insurance companies involved. You got all kinds of moving things and regulations. But paying that ransom certainly doesn't make it better. And so we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to defend against that. The other thing is, if you pay the ransom, unfortunately, what you've done is told criminals that when this happens, you are willing then to pay a ransom. So your immediate remediation better be yesterday, or this is just going to happen to you again in the very near future, because they know you're going to pay. And so that's what we focus on, is making sure that we have every prevention that we can have in place within reason, and then making sure that there's plans in place if an event does happen, that we're not put in a position where we need to pay a ransom.
You talked there, Paul, about the kind of the fast response, and then I've heard you talk about the 35-second rule before. How important is that early detection piece? And have you a couple of things that you look for across the companies that you have under your remit to identify, I suppose, anomalies that may indicate a breach scenario?
So obviously there's a lot of tools in the market. Every day there's a new tool that comes out that says it's the best tool. I believe in a lot of testing in that. And so things like managed detection and response, using AR or AI in tools like XDR, so that we're scanning for user behaviors and anomalies can then be noticed right away. Obviously, if anything malicious tries to run, we want that to be, that execution to be stopped immediately. And then behind that, there needs to be a team of security folks to then go through, as soon as those alerts come up, identify if it's an issue and take action. And so industry wide, we have what I consider a complete failure in that point, in that the average time to detect an incident and contain it is 100 days. And 100 days compared to 35 seconds is a big variable and a lot of time for someone to do bad things. So one, we want to use zero trust. We want to make sure that applications aren't talking to applications that they don't need to, right? So stealing cookies from a Chrome browser can get you around multi-factor authentication now, right? We want to make sure that Chrome can't talk to PowerShell. It can't talk to command prompt. It can't talk to any application that it doesn't need to. Excuse me. And so those things are then restricted at that level. And then we need to have constant scanning and analysis of all the other data flows. And that can become a cumbersome project if you don't really sit down and work out a strategy into how to form that stack, make sure everything's running, and then test against it to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do, which is probably the most important part of the whole thing.
I'm well aware of the complexities of trying to needle in a haystack. I've become a strong believer in exposure based detection, and what I mean by that is architecturally driven security event identified, pen test results formulated into gaps in your event, in your event logging and detection capabilities, and then different blends of red and purple and other teaming to fill the gaps there, along with an extrapolation of threat intelligence over the top where appropriate. But I'm very conscious that an SME doesn't have that level of either personnel or capability to put that together. So I suppose a lot of the tools in the market have to be relied on in this space. But it's yeah, I think logging is one of those things that you can take every login and you'll always miss something because they're finding new ways around them, or it's an exploit that hasn't been seen before in terms of a 0 day or something. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting field. And then, as you say, if somebody gets phished up front and just give the credentials away, and they don't have MFA or conditional access or whatever, the bad guys in anyway. So it's yeah, it's definitely one of those areas that is cumbersome, to say the least, to get right. Paul, you talked a little bit about regulation there a minute ago, and as I was doing a little bit of reading on yourself, I came across the NYS SHIELD Act, 2019. I think it was envisaged. Can you break down what that means for business owners? I'm always intrigued to hear about different pieces of regulation, and I'm fascinated that in the States, each state has a different nuanced regulation from the next one. So it's different to Europe, where we have kind of set regulation that applies to all. But I like to learn from different regulatory spaces and see if there's something that we may have missed ourselves. So if you don't mind, if you're familiar, can you just give me a bit of an overview of what that act is, please?
Yeah, so I think GDPR is really where all this started, right? Um, and in the U.S. now we have several states. California was first, New York was second. We now have several other states that are coming out with state regulations. One of the interesting nuances about New York State SHIELD Act is it's not contained to New York State, right? So basically what that law says is if you do business with any business or person that is in New York State, you are now covered under New York State SHIELD Act. So if you have a business in California or elsewhere and you have customers that are in New York, you have to adhere to those rules, or you can face, obviously, the government action is fines. And those fines aren't, they're $5,000 a piece, right? And so, that doesn't seem like maybe a whole lot. If you have 50 employees and none of them have MFA, and you're not protecting that, so each one of those incidences now becomes that $5,000 fine. And yes, there's upper limits on that, but I think we miss a lot of times when we look at fines for regulations is the number. Okay, well, you didn't have multi-factor. That's not a fine for the entire thing. That's a fine for each incident or each instance of that. And so I think we have a growing compliance market. Like at some point, each state, we do this all the time in the US where each state comes out with a law, enough states start to have that law, and then we get a federal law. Not that we don't have them already, but incorporates those new pieces that are coming out from each state. And I think that, the big takeaway from SHIELD Act is that you don't have to be in the state. The law reaches outside of the state, as it pertains to business owners.
That's it. That is interesting. The compound effect of each violation, I think, would scare the bejesus out of some companies in Europe if you brought that one in. We're used to a penalty for non-compliance, but not a penalty for non-compliance per user. That would be that would be a game changer, I suspect.
Well, it comes down to, like, there's a local government recently that just had a breach, and it come to find out a few weeks later that that's because they had employees that had left. Those accounts were left active. They didn't have MFA on them, right? And so, as much as those fines are steep, the compliance is actually there to help you, right? To protect your business. And so it's unfortunate that we need to have fines, in my mind. I've been trying to put out as much content and education around these issues as I possibly can. But we need to understand, just like the rules on the road, we don't want drunk drivers driving on the road, because that puts everyone else at risk. And so these compliance laws really, to me, are the basics that you should be having to drive your business in that market.
But it's also human nature, if there's no carrot and no stick, it's people just keep the carrot. It's that's money I don't need to spend, but when there's a bit of a stick there and some implications for, I suppose, poor posture, that does help in securing down environments and getting things a little bit better for all of us. No, thanks for those insights, Paul. That was great. I want to swap tack now, and I want to talk about something I think you're quite familiar with, which is traveling with technology and protecting yourself on the road. I think it's an area that you're interested in, around hotel Wi-Fi's, airports, ports for charging your phone in public spaces. Can you talk to me a little bit about that space, and what advice would you give to people who are traveling with technology?
So, this is a conversation that I've had both publicly and with friends and so forth, and people usually think I'm a little bit crazy. So we'll start with that. It may sound a little bit out there. You shouldn't do any of those things. Not the public charging station, not the public Wi-Fi, none of those things, without serious thought and consideration, right? If we have a cell phone, generally we have cell phone connection, right? If we don't, then maybe we're switching to public Wi-Fi. If you do not have a VPN and you're connecting to public Wi-Fi, you are potentially giving away all your data. There's just no easy way to say that, right? For those of us in the business world, we go to conferences a lot. Last year, I went to a conference, showed up at the hotel, and it's a tech conference. We're full of cybersecurity folks, and the hotel had been hacked. No one could check in because the hotel had been hacked, right? And this happened just prior to a cybersecurity conference, right? And so it's those kind of incidences where, had those folks already been checked in and conference going on and using that Wi-Fi unprotected, what were those hackers going to get? Potentially the keys to their accounts and all of their client accounts. And so we don't necessarily view that. We want the instant gratification. I need to be on the Wi-Fi. I have to check my Facebook. I have to check my email. I promise you it's not that important. I promise you that losing your identity, having your information stolen, is definitely not the outcome that you wanted by I needed to check my email real quick. There likely wasn't anything important enough in your email to lose all your information and get your identity stolen and all the negatives that come after that. In terms of the airport, and using those little chargers, what I tell people all the time is bring your own charging block always. You can actually buy them now that where they don't transfer data, right? They just don't have that capability because it's very easy. So we look at things like the gas stations, right? They replace the keypad and then they're stealing your PIN number and so forth in the card skimmers. It's just as easy to be in an airport where no one's watching those chargers and pop that out and pop in your own charger that's designed, has a script in there that just pulls the data from whatever it's plugged into. And it sucks that we're in that world, but that is unfortunately the world that we live in. So if you don't have a VPN, no public Wi-Fi, I tell people when you leave the house, never have your Wi-Fi set to automatically connect. And that's something that a lot of folks do. But if there's a Wi-Fi out there without a password and you automatically connect to it, it was likely there for a reason.
It's great for finding out who's hanging around your house, though.
There's just so many tools now, that are available. It used to be, back in the day, you had to have knowledge on how to create scripts and how to exploit things. And unfortunately, there's a lot of tools now that you can just purchase that do that for you, which expands to criminal element that did not have that capability, right? They can just go on the dark web, buy what they need, or in some cases, buy a Flipper Zero and do a little bit of coding there and create their own.
I do have to say, though, Flipper Zero is one of my favorite tools in the whole world.
It is such a fun tool. I don't disagree with that. But like anything else, the tool is the tool. What you do with it depends on how we look at that usage, right? So Flipper Zero is a great tool. There's people that are going to misuse it, just like any other tool. So, we just have to be aware.
No, we sure do, Paul. And it kind of brings me then, what are your thoughts on the dangers of IoT devices? I have some particular dislikes to IoT and their lack of software updates and their poor security. But I'd like to get your perspective on the IoT market and the smart home devices that everybody seems to be ramming in, from either connected doorbells to lights that change color in their houses. Have you got any perspectives on the IoT world?
I think IoT devices can be secured. I don't think they currently are, right? And especially in home use, you can lock down your home network. Don't believe that your ISP does it for you, regardless of what their marketing says. It's connected, it's secured. No, it's not. That's absolutely false. We saw with Ring camera years ago that these things could be exploited. I definitely do not think there's been enough move in that industry to get those devices secured. So I was in an office the other day meeting with a client, and in the office next door, they have like 5 printers. All the Wi-Fi is on for the printers and open. Right. And even the client said to me, I thought about messing with them and connecting and just printing out something that says you've been hacked. And it's, that's because you're the nice neighbor. The hacker doesn't think that way. And what we don't realize a lot of times with the IoT devices is they have network cards in them. They're not these simple devices anymore. You can run scripts from them. You can get a layout of the entire network and find out what's there. So in terms of cameras, sometimes people are just looking to look at a camera, right? They want to get into your cameras to see what's going on. That's dangerous in that if you're on vacation, somebody's been checking your cameras for 3 days, they know nobody's home, right? That potentially leads to theft at your home. The bigger issue that I see is once they get into those IoT devices, the next step is getting into your computers and your phones and other devices from that launching point. And even if you detect on your computer, hey, you had a virus, this happened, and you stop it, if they have persistence on those IoT devices, they're not going away, right? And so we don't really have software solutions on those IoT devices, at least not to the degree that I think manufacturers should be installing them. And so that point of entry becomes the network. We've got to make sure that our home networks are locked down and we have some rules in place. Obviously, as soon as you get an IoT device, first thing you're going to do is change that default password. There's nothing easier for a criminal or a hacker to get in and say, we're just going to run the default password that we know goes to these cameras, right? If you haven't changed that, now they're in, they have admin, like you gave the farm away.
And I can't tell you how many times I've run a pen test in an organization. I've gone onto something silly like a printer or a camera device, and then I've been able, to pivot from there, use Nmap, map it out, start to relay the brand names, and with a simple Google of what's the default login credentials, boom, in straight at full access. Especially a router or a switch or a camera system. I can count on more times than I would like how many times that default credential has remained in situ. It hasn't been switched off, and it does give you a demarcation point on the network. Paul, I'm interested, and just because of the absolute wave of conversation at the moment around artificial intelligence and generative AI, are you seeing shadow AI in small, medium businesses that you're looking after at the moment? Are you seeing that becoming a problem the same as the corporations are? Are SMBs using generative AI, or is the hype cycle just not there for them at the moment?
So I think small businesses are definitely using AI. That might be with or without the management or ownership knowledge, right? Um, and that to me is kind of the big danger there, is that if we're using AI, we need to make sure that we're securing those platforms, right? That we're not giving our business data out to a large learning model, right? First of all, that's not good for your business. That has potentially very bad outcomes depending on what data is there. And then, do we have our employees using AI and we're not aware of it, right? Which is a bigger issue because that means they're generally going to be using free services, right? And I think after, this many years, we understand that free services aren't free, that there's data collection happening, there's other things happening, right? And so if we're going to use AI in the business, let's make sure that it's on a secure platform and our information isn't getting out there. But in the same time, we need to be using AI in our defense because we're going to get attacked with AI, right? And this is generally the difference that criminal organizations have, is speed to market. A lot of small and medium businesses are talking about, how do we use AI? How do we use AI maybe in our security? But they're already being attacked by AI. The reason why phishing emails have not only been good, the human error problem, but they're getting exponentially better because we don't have a lot of the same identifiers we used to have. You could look at a logo, you could look at the language in a phishing email and say something doesn't seem right. Now that folks are using AI, they can literally go in and say, I am in New York, I want to use this vernacular from this area. That email, the logo is going to be AI generated to look like Microsoft or whoever else. That email is going to be exponentially more difficult for end users that already had trouble identifying phishing emails. So if we're not using AI to look at those things, we have a big security gap here now where it's being used against us. We're not using it to defend. And I know there's, people have a lot of opinions on AI. It's terrible. It's great. What we know about technology is it's here. And regardless of your opinion on it, it's not going anywhere. And criminals are going to use it. You need to have a plan on how you're going to use it and how you're going to defend against it.
That's very true, and I think there's been a paradigm in terms of the shift of in the phishing space as well around security culture. I remember the psychology behind the misspellings in a phishing email used to be not to draw awareness that they were a phishing email, but to weed out the vigilant, so that the person that clicked on them was the was an easier target because they weren't paying attention. Whereas now with AI, it's been crafted to the individual. It's specific to information that pertains to you, and therefore it's the psychology has changed. It's actually it's familiar. It's targeted. It's trying to draw you in a far different way. It's not trying to weed you out in terms of vigilance. So it's far more dangerous because you get a higher click rate in when you go at it that way. When you can, I can take information that's either been made available through a breach or through something else, and then I can target it. And I had Michael Freeman on a couple of months back, and he was talking about attacks where they were seeing company Slack accounts being hijacked, all of the data pulled out, and then extortion attempts made based on that information to executives saying, "Well, you were told about all of these problems and you covered it up, etc. So if you don't transfer this and much money, etc., and that's only available through large language models being able to contextualize and to drill through huge amounts of data, and that's quite a frightening change in the attack surface, especially from a data driven attack perspective, not just we found a vulnerability and broke in. So it is a watch item. I think we're going to see lots of interesting breaches over the next year or so as bad actors come up with more creative ways to use this technology and this capability for gains that are not exactly to be to be admired. But sometimes the bad guys have great ideas, and they just apply them to the wrong causes. Paul,
You
before
know,
we wrap up, if you were to give small medium businesses a couple of pieces of advice to protect themselves today for tomorrow, what would those be?
uh, two really huge ones. One, human error has always been an issue. It's always going to be an issue, and it stems from lack of training. You not only have to do your compliance thing and do the annual security training, depending on your industry, but that should be followed up. You should be doing it weekly and monthly in the form of small tech tips or, company meeting, however you want to facilitate that. But training for a culture of security and people understanding their role in that culture is paramount. Second would be, well, maybe not second, these are probably equal. Um, I can tell you whether you have vulnerabilities based on one question always. When was the last time you had a penetration test? If your answer isn't within the last 90 days, and even sometimes if it is, but if it wasn't within the last 90 days, there's something. Um, and I say that from a place of doing tons of penetration tests for people and finding that exploit. And a lot of times the answer is we did one last year. Well, as you alluded to earlier, in the security space, we wake up every morning to a giant list of alerts and 0 days and all this new stuff that came out. If you're not testing quarterly to make sure that your security is working the way it should work, I can with 100% certainty tell you that there's vulnerabilities you don't know exist. And the unfortunate thing is, I always look at cybersecurity folks when hiring and so forth in, does this person think like a hacker? Because that's probably why I'm as good as I am uh, at this industry, is that I look for the threats first, right? And the problem is that some of us have a moral compass and we play on the right side of the team trying to protect businesses. But don't underestimate the folks on the other side just because they took an easier route, right? That there are folks out there that are highly skilled at getting into your systems. And if you're not testing to make sure they can't, they will.
Thanks, Paul. That's great advice to take away. I really appreciate you coming on today, and I'm hopeful that the listeners get some value out of that conversation, especially in the SMB space, which is an area that I'm very aware doesn't get a lot of attention when it comes to security, but needs it just as much as everyone else. So I really do appreciate you coming on to talk to that space.
Oh, I appreciate you having me on so much. I think, I really respect what you're doing. I think it's vital that we're having these conversations, because there's an education gap that needs to be filled. So thank you for doing this and having me on.
Thanks a million, Paul, and have a good day.
You too.